I just bought every new iPhone model, and while they all look like interesting products, some are definitely smarter upgrades than others. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of great features and updates to these devices, and Apple markets them extremely well. But whether or not they're useful to you is gonna depend on what phone you currently have and how you use it. Today, I'm taking a first look at each new iPhone, going over what's new, and comparing them to each other and to past models. So with that said, let's get into it. Hey everyone, Kyle Erickson here. This year's iPhone releases, at least for me, are probably the most exciting we've seen in years. The iPhone 17 got some super meaningful upgrades that I'm really pumped for. We got a brand new model in the Air to take a look at, and of course there is the Pro, which I think has the boldest design that we've seen in an iPhone, at least in the Pro lineup. That being said, there is a lot of overlap between each of these, and before I deep dive into reviews on all of this stuff, I thought it might be useful to do a first look at all of this gear for anyone who is maybe on the fence about upgrading, or who just doesn't know what to upgrade to. By the way, I will have very in-depth reviews on each of these, so make sure that you're subscribed if you want to see those. The first one is going to be next week with the iPhone 17, but let's dig into these and go over the differences between them and some of the details for each device. Unboxing these phones is going to feel pretty much the same as any other release. You've got the same packaging with some paperwork, a braided USB-C cable for each of these, and of course, the devices themselves. Apple did expand eSIM-only devices this year to 14 countries, so if you're like me and you live in Canada, there will not be a SIM tool in any of these, which I am a little disappointed about, but let's get into the actual phones. In regards to the iPhone 17, this looks and feels pretty much the same as the 16. The 17 is a touch heavier than the 16 by about 7 grams, but holding them in my hands, it really doesn't feel that much different. You can see that you've got a touch smaller bezel on the 17 over the 16, because it does have a bigger 6.3-inch display versus 6.1 in the 16. And color-wise, the 16 is a bit lighter as well. I did choose to get black in the 17, as I'm not super big on the color lineup this year. I don't mind sage green, but I much prefer the colors the 16 has. I kinda wish Apple would axe pastel colors and stick with vibrant ones. That's ultimately why I chose the 17 Pro in Cosmic Orange. And now that I've got it in my hand, I'm so glad that I chose to get this over silver or blue. I was on the fence about which color to get until I saw this graphic on Reddit that showed every Pro iPhone color made. And this is really the first one that's a bright, bold color, so I figured that that was the one to go with. But putting that in a new black tech woven case pairs really nicely with my new Apple Watch Ultra 3. In fact, I would say that the new design does kind of have the same design language as the Ultra 3, where it feels a lot more about function over form. This design makes room for a bigger battery, better cooling, and the new camera system, and just looking at the phone, I think it looks much better in person than online. The orange has a metallic or anodized sheen to it, and I know a lot of people aren't super keen on the look, but to me, this just has a bit more character than previous models. I also thought that it would be heavier than it is just looking at photos and videos online. Maybe it's the bigger camera bump or something, but similar to the regular iPhone, it has just a touch more weight than the 16 Pro, but feels largely the same in the hand. The corners do seem to have more round edges, so I suppose if you were going caseless, it might feel a little bit better, and a side benefit to having this camera plateau is that it does feel good to have a place to rest your finger on. If that isn't your vibe though, I think opposite to this, the iPhone Air is definitely geared towards form over function, and seeing this in person, this is a beautiful phone. It's only 5.6 millimeters thick, so it is a bit thicker than the M4 iPad Pro, but comparing it to these other iPhones, you can see just how much difference there is. And kinda like the Pro, I feel like you get a different impression of it in person versus online. This particular one is sky blue, which I liked a little bit more over silver, gold, or black, and out of all of these, I would say that this gives off the most premium polished feel. It's also built completely out of titanium, which is a first for any iPhone, which is supposed to make it a little bit more durable and rigid. I'm not gonna test that right now for obvious reasons, but this weighs in at 162 grams. So if you ever used an iPhone 12, this is about the same weight, which is pretty impressive given that you do have a 6.5-inch display on it. That being said, you do give up some things with this being so thin. The speakers in here are quieter and only fire out of the top of the device, so it won't be as good for listening to music or watching content, but given how this feels and looks, I'm not so sure that it would be a deal breaker for most folks. You'll see putting them all side by side, the Air is a tad bigger and right in the middle between a regular iPhone and a Pro Max, but all the displays this year have the exact same specs, all with 120Hz ProMotion OLED panels, with a bump in outdoor brightness on the ProMotion from last year, going from 2000 nits max brightness to 3000 this year. These also got new screen coatings with Ceramic Shield 2, which I believe is supposed to be 3 times more scratch resistant than the previous coating. And I know that scratches were something that a lot of people complained about last year, so I suppose that's notable. But you also get a new anti-reflective coating, which, looking at it myself, looks pretty good. Not only does it reduce reflections a lot more, but I feel like it adds a bit of depth to the picture or something, but in any case, this is a huge upgrade for the 17, and I think it might make it the best option for 90% of people out there. Because outside of dropping one camera lens, it's gonna feel pretty much the same as the Pro now in terms of usability. The iPhone 17 does have an A19 chipset, where the 17 Pro and the Air have the A19 Pro, but outside of benchmarks and super resource-heavy games, you're probably not gonna notice much of a difference here, but I'll definitely put these through a bunch of tests in my full reviews. I do think that it is kind of weird that the Air has the A19 Pro chip, because it really doesn't carry any of the Pro features, and it lines up a lot closer to the regular iPhone, just with one less camera lens. That main rear camera is the same between the Air and the 17, where the 17 Pro has a bit bigger sensor, so images will likely be a bit better on that particular lens, but all of these have the 1x and 2x optical zoom ranges. The regular 17 adds a brand new 48 megapixel ultrawide this year, that's up from 12 last year. And again, the ultrawide is the same one that's in the Pro this year, so that's another thing that you gain in the regular 17 that you didn't have in the 16. The only difference in terms of lenses that you get with the Pro is with the telephoto, and that's completely different this year. Where the 16 Pro had a 12 megapixel 5x lens, the 17 Pro has a 48 megapixel 4x lens, so it doesn't reach as far, but just like the main lens, you get an optical crop option, so you get up to 8x with no digital zoom. I actually preferred when the Pro telephoto was at 3x, so I'm really happy that they stepped that back from 5, and I have seen some early photo samples from other people who got the phones early at the Apple event, and they do look pretty incredible. I would say the big advantage the 17 Pro has over the other models is the Pro photo and video options, where you can now shoot ProRes RAW with Apple Log 2 that's supposed to have better dynamic range with more cinematic highlights and shadow roll-off over Apple Log 1. Honestly, the iPhone 16 Pro and 15 Pro for that matter still take pretty great video and photos, so I would definitely wait and see just how much better this is in some tests before running out and thinking that you have to buy a 17 Pro if you've got one of those other models. Outside that, the front-facing camera on all of these is exactly the same, where you've got a new 18 megapixel square sensor, which allows you to shoot in both landscape and portrait modes without having to rotate your phone, and Apple will use Center Stage in here to automatically adjust orientations based on what it sees, which is pretty neat. The stabilization on that lens is also supposed to be better, and you get a new dual capture feature where you can record on both the front and rear cameras at the same time, which will probably be useful to some people, but I would say that outside of the camera system and just the overall design, the other main differences here are with connectivity and battery life. Now, all of these have USB-C ports, but the Pro is the only one with USB 3 speeds, where the 17 and the Air are only USB 2, which I think is fine given that most people are probably not doing a lot of wired transfers. And in terms of wireless connectivity, all of these have Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 6. So you should be fine there regardless of which model you choose. And I have heard that AirDrop might work a little bit better on these, but we'll wait and see on that. And battery and charging is a bit different between all of these. The regular 17 and 17 Pro both get a new charging spec this year that goes up to 25 watts wireless or 40 wired. So they can now go from 0 to 50% battery life in 20 minutes according to Apple, where the Air isn't quite as good and matches the charging spec from last year. I assume that's to do with controlling the heat with it being so thin, but apparently the battery life will be about the same as the iPhone 16 Pro, I believe, which would be more than reasonable, where the 17 is supposed to have a whopping 30% battery life increase over the 16. And the 17 Pro is supposed to be about 20 to 25% better. But again, we'll see what all of this is like when I run through a bunch of testing. With all of that being said, if I was shopping for a phone right now and I wasn't making content or I didn't need the Pro video features that you get with the 17 Pro, the iPhone 17, I think, is the phone to get this year, and provided all my testing goes well over the next week, this might be the best phone to get this year, just purely based on value. These all start at 256 gigs of storage, so no 128 option this year, but the iPhone 17 did not increase at all in price, so you get way more than you did in the 16. At the same $799 USD, where the Air goes up to $999 USD for arguably less functionality, although it does look the best out of the bunch. And the Pro starts at $1099, where you will gain some of those advanced video modes, shooting raw photos, and a few other things, but I would say very few people need them. If you are upgrading from a previous model and you do want something right now, if you're coming from an iPhone 15 or lower, the 17 is probably going to be a big jump for you, and frankly, even the 16 to the 17 feels quite different. You get a bigger screen that's a lot smoother, you get an always-on display, and a better camera system, but if you're someone who just uses your phone to go on social media, and you don't know what 60 or 120 Hz means, and you're fine with what you've got, there really is no reason to upgrade. I would say going from a 16 Pro to a 17 Pro is definitely an iterative upgrade, so unless you really like some of the new features or you're due for an upgrade, the last couple of generations are probably still fine. And I think the Air, you're probably just buying because it has a really unique design or that it's super light and has a slightly bigger screen size. Like I said, I am going to deep dive into all of these, so stay tuned for that. I will be using each of them as my main device, and I'll also run through a bunch of tests, like I mentioned, but that's all I've got for you today. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more tech-related content, or help me design an iPhone Solid that's an inch thick of solid steel with 6 cameras and a 5-inch display, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next upload.